Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Dan, and I have a very special guest with me today. She's a friend of mine and has been doing real estate for a number of years now. She has practiced in New York City, San Francisco, and now in Southern California. She has been for the last 3 years a Super Lawyers Rising Star, and at the beginning of her career, handled pro bono cases for the city of San Francisco to help low-income tenants from being evicted by a landlord. She's the founder and owner of Blumenstein Law, a small business and small firm here in Southern California. I want to welcome Laura Blumenstein.
Hi, Dan. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be on.
Thank you for spending some time with me. I know when I first started this particular series, you know, coronavirus just kind of started coming out, and I got a lot of calls to my office and emails to my office saying, "Hey, I'm a renter. I own this commercial, or I rent this commercial space, and with no one going out, no one coming to my restaurant or coming to my store, I can't afford rent." And I wanted to bring someone like you on because of your expertise and some of the things you've handled um, for your clients, both landlord and on the tenant side. But before we go there, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, why you got into law, and then how you ended up owning your own practice?
Sure. Well, I got into law because I was a tenacious little 5-year-old who wanted to be president. And I would run around telling everybody my plans to take over the world as and a dear friend, a family friend, said, she might make a good lawyer. And so that stuck with me. And I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And when I started working in law, I worked for larger firms and decided that I wanted to go out on my own and make my own mark in the world and try to see if I could maybe help people that I wouldn't have access to at larger firms, and to have a boutique law firm that works with my clients as opposed to working for my clients. So that's been my business model. And I'm also a small business owner in the COVID-19 era. So I am right there with you. As you can tell, I'm working from home right now. I'm not at my office. Our office is not closed by the landlord, but my practice and my staff is working remotely right now as well. So we're all in this together.
Okay, yeah, very good. And tell me a little bit about, you're talking about working for your clients, but not. I'm sorry, how'd you put it?
Working
Well,
with my
with
clients.
your clients. Tell me a little bit about that transition from, working from firms where, nice paycheck every 2 weeks or however it is, to like opening your doors and then taking that experience on and running your own practice.
Well, I had some phenomenal mentors, luckily, who really taught me the ropes of running the of law, which is completely different than being an attorney. And it's been a humbling but gratifying experience. At larger law firms, quite often you don't really have much say over the clients you're working with. You might be handed volumes of cases and you're not feeling that you can give adequate attention, but there's not much you can do. And I wanted to practice on a different scale to where I work with my clients, I'm in communication with my clients constantly. They are also helping me with their case. And I want to make sure that my client is as involved as I am, because it's their interest at stake ultimately. And I think it makes a big difference with the working relationship.
Yeah. So I know in the past you've worked with low income residents in San Francisco, helping them, through the eviction process. Um, did you have any other experience in your other firms working in the real estate area as well?
So Blumenstein Law, we primarily handle real estate transactional and litigation matters. So the work I did in San Francisco was right out of law school, and I'd already passed California bar, but I had not passed New York, so I was studying for the New York bar. So it was something I could do pro bono on a volunteer basis to get time in the courtroom and to help give back to our community. At the time I was living in San Francisco, and I just opened up my own practice. And it was a fantastic experience. But right now, obviously with COVID, we're seeing circumstances that we've never seen. It's a little bit of the Wild West. Our courts are currently closed. We don't have much precedent for some of the things that are going on. So I'm here to hopefully talk with you and give your audience a little bit of knowledge and tips on how to navigate the landlord-tenant relationship during this time.
Okay, this is fantastic. I think it'd be valuable for our listeners. Maybe share maybe the number one thing that maybe landlords or tenants should know about their commercial leases during this time here.
Well, like I said a minute ago, we're all in this together, and everybody is hurting in some way. And the best thing landlords and tenants can do is communicate and try not to be a jerk, no matter how upset you are at the circumstances or with the way the other party's responding. Try not to be adversarial. And the best thing that can happen is landlords and tenants work together through this time, because it's only advantageous to them both.
Yeah, and I think that's probably in most cases, not necessarily during COVID, right? If there's two parties, communication is probably the key here, like a regular relationship.
Well, that and having a good attorney.
Right.
No, absolutely. I mean, at any time, but especially now, because we really have to make sure that everybody's protected to the extent possible, and generous than you would normally be, and a little more forgiving on some instances, and try to do your best to navigate these times. I think Wild West is the perfect term. We have not had anything like that in a lifetime, and a lot of people are hurting right now.
Yeah. So maybe we'll talk a little bit, maybe kind of some of the consequences, because for some people, there were 3 months behind on rent before something happened, and unfortunately they just either want to bury themselves in their heads in the sand, or just like in the middle of the night come out and pack up other stuff and go. What's the consequences of something like that?
The last thing you want to do is breach your lease or default. It will only lead to eviction proceedings, often, which can hurt your credit. You'll have judgments against you. You could be chased down for these judgments. There's definitely better ways to go around it. And as a tenant, if a tenant comes to me and says, as of March, my business has been shut down. I don't have clients walking in the store. What do? I can't pay my rent. Where in the contract does this give me an escape clause? And the unfortunate truth is there's probably not an escape clause, but there are options. As a tenant, first thing I ever say, communicate with your landlord at the first notice that you might not be able to pay rent. Or if you haven't paid that, May rent, get in contact with them as quickly as possible. The thing is, landlords are going to want to work with tenants. It's in their best interest to work with the tenant ultimately. And you can always negotiate some sort of a deal. So, for instance, I have a client who owns a restaurant, and he owns a couple of them around Orange County, and he's behind on his rent. And what we're finding is landlords are reacting differently when he reached out to them and requested a deferral. And deferment of rent is probably the most requested amendment right now, I guess you could say, amendment to the lease. Landlords are acknowledging that they've had some relief, and they are trying to help and work with their tenant. But it's important that the tenant phrases it in a manner that shows that they're going to have a working relationship going forward. So if you have a 5-year lease, you definitely want to relay to your landlord all the steps you're doing to get your business ready for post shelter in place. And when we reopen California, you want to be in contact with your landlord about your financials. You want to show that your business is sustainable post-COVID, and that this wasn't a business that was already having issues prior to COVID. And landlords are absolutely looking at this. My client, who is the restaurateur, he had to produce financials. He had to prove that this was COVID related. He also showed his plan, how he's going to go forward once California reopens, and how his business will continue to be sustainable. And ultimately, we had negotiations that were successful because the landlords realized that while they're going to defer rent payments for a few months and they're going to amortize it over the length of the lease, it was to their benefit because he's a good tenant and he has a business that is going to be successful. So it's important to show the landlord the whole picture.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned pretty well that, for the landlord, if I have maybe it's a little slow now, but they provided me with a plan. That's better than me trying to evict them, and then, no one's gonna rent for me, right? Because no one's got any money. So it's easier for me to keep someone like this tenant who's already showed me a plan, rather than to go get someone else, which probably won't happen.
I have a client who wanted to evict a commercial tenant recently, and we had a very long and maybe a coming to Jesus moment. But, the problem right now, not only are the courts closed, so while you can give your notice, you can't file anything with the courts. We know that there's going to be a backlog. And during the eviction process, you're not going to be collecting rent from your tenants. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, you're going to be taking a big hit. You're going to have to go through an eviction process. I'm sure attorney fees are involved. Yep. And ultimately, what do you end up with? An empty space. And this is not the time that you want empty spaces. Often, if a landlord bought the business and is subject to lenders, that's also another issue. So it's in the best interest for landlords and tenants to work together if they can.
Yeah. So you talked about your client providing financials and kind of a longer term plan about how they would be able to pay rent in the future. So that kind of leads me to the second thing is like, what's the next thing that landlords and tenants should know about, their leases during this time?
Well, the first thing you want to do always when any trouble arises with regards to your commercial lease, review your lease. Mm-hmm. And this is the point where I would say, if you can, hire an attorney to review your lease, because there is some legalese in there that could be somewhat confusing. But review your lease. You don't want to be in breach, and you want to look towards the lease provisions that discuss payment periods, default, cure, how you cure your default, any notice requirements. You don't want the landlord to be claiming he gave you 3-day notice and you failed to cure and you had no idea. He faxed it to that fax number that you gave up long ago. Yeah. So, just some ideas of things you want to look at. Also, it's always a good idea to look at your clauses, operation clause, continuous operation clause. Are you required to continuously run your business? Is your landlord required to service the property or do things that he's not doing? So these are all good for negotiation tactics, because while the landlord may point to you and say, hey, you're not making your payments per your lease, the tenant can look at the landlord and say, you're also not allowing us to the property, and you have closed it and you've built a wall around it. So then you come into impossibility and impracticability excuses. So it's always helpful to have some leverage when you're negotiating, and the lease is definitely the first place to look.
Yeah. So you talk about impossibility, and some of the language that's been kind of floating around on the internet is force majeure clause. Can you tell me a little bit what that is, and how have you seen it play out for some of your clients?
So currently, within the COVID epidemic, force majeure hasn't been a huge topic of discussion because it's not typically an excuse for non-payment. Mm-hmm. It's usually an exception. And just to back up, force majeure would be an act of God or something that has happened that is unpredictable and impossible to have foreseen. Yeah. Unforeseeability. So it works it comes into play when the landlord maybe can't open the door because the government or governor has ordered shelter in place. And he may be excused from performance because of the governor's order, and you can claim force majeure. Now, alternatively, although it's not typically used for a non-payment, I would say as a tenant, if I was arguing on behalf of a tenant, I would absolutely bring it up. We look at impossibility. Well, if a restaurant's closed because the governor's order, then it would absolutely be an unforeseeable circumstance, and the pandemic could be construed as an act of God. So I have not personally been seeing this topic raised too much yet. Once evictions are filed in the court system, is it going to be used as defense or excuse? Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. So, going back to the plan that your client had with the landlord, how typically far out should they kind of project as far as like them being successful, and then show that the landlord will allow them, and then what part does the landlord play as far as like, okay, how can we both make this plan sustainable so that the tenant stays in and then the landlord still gets their money?
Well, that's where the negotiations come in. And like I said, if you're a tenant and you're owing monies, first thing to do is communicate. And the same with the landlord. If the landlord can't open the business or can't perform services that are mandated in the lease, communicate with your with your opposing party, I guess I should say, with your tenant, your landlord. Communication is key. And then once you start to negotiate, you already have that rapport and hopefully a level of confidence psychologically. It gives others confidence when somebody has let you down and they keep reaching out. Hey, I want to make this right. I want to do what I can. Here's how I'm going to do it. So when you start negotiating, there's absolutely some tactics we're trying to tell clients, think outside of the box. One way is, most popular right now is rent deferral. So my client was willing to, if the landlord was agreeable to deferring rent for 3 months, my client was willing to tack on that rent and have it amortized over the existing period of his lease. Other landlords, we had one tenant who offered to triple his security deposit.
Oh, okay.
We have, let's see, what else have we used? Landlords can also agree to waive late fees. That's a courtesy, I would suggest, especially just to give kind of a good faith effort. Yeah. Some are offering to sign an extension. So I had a client who offered to, and he's only 2 years out of 5 years on his lease, and he offered to extend his lease. And so the landlord and the tenant had always had a good relationship, or at least the property manager and the tenant had always had a good relationship. And so that was something that the property management was really interested in, because they obviously saw the business was successful and will likely be successful again. I think the main issue is arising from what I'm seeing are the clients that are in hospitality, restaurant industry, retail, because some of these businesses were already hurting before COVID, and landlords are being a little bit less flexible, and that's why doing things like presenting your financials or a plan going forward can really help ease their mind as to whether your business is going to be sustainable.
Okay, you gave us some pretty good, tactics and examples of what your clients have been doing on both sides. Can you give us like maybe one or two things more that you've seen successful? Maybe it's your practice, or maybe some of your other real estate colleagues have done to negotiate through this coronavirus.
Sure. Well, as to start, one thing to do is definitely look at your insurance coverage. Mm-hmm. There often are provisions for tenants who have business interruption, And as far as COVID, I can't think of a better example of business interruption. It's pretty black and white in this
Mhm.
instance. And that can really help tenants get through. And consult your insurance or your broker or your insurer prior to signing anything or even negotiating with your landlord, because you don't want to hurry up and get back to business and then you just hurt your chance of having coverage for your business interruption.
Mhm.
So talk to your broker, and then landlords often have coverage for loss of rent.
Mhm.
So that can really help them kind of see it through and get to the other side of this. I mean, let's face it, any bit helps at this point.
Yeah, yeah. So, oftentimes this might result in maybe a renegotiation of the lease, but maybe let's just talk about negotiations in general. Can you give us some tips about how, us as tenants can effectively, maybe both sides, tenants and landlord, how can effectively negotiate? I mean, let's kind of be honest. Most tenants is landlords usually have their own team,
Mhm.
their property management, and tenants, if we're lucky, we have the attorney to do it. But can you give us some tips, or tenant rep? But can you give us some tips how to help negotiate? Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
So from a tenant's
yeah.
perspective, the last thing you want to do is add more burden to your landlord, especially if your landlord is, you got to assume at this point, he's probably having multiple tenants approach him to defer rent or rental reduction. Um, I heard a statistic that in April, 90% of all commercial leases were paid. As of May, we're at 60%. And
Ooh.
that's a huge, huge drop.
Yeah.
So landlords definitely are feeling the burden right now. One tactic I offered to clients was, if you're come through to negotiations, one negotiation tactic is to offer to pay for the attorney fees to amend the lease or to prepare a forbearance agreement, whatever the case may be. You don't want to prepare these documents as a layman. You don't know what is going to be coming down the courts. We got to figure that there's going to be added levels of protection from state government, local government, and our court system. It's really important that your amendments are written by attorneys
Mm.
just to protect yourself. And it takes the burden off the landlord. The last thing the landlord may want to do is deal with his team of attorneys at this point. And also it cuts into his bottom line. If he's having to spend money on attorney fees to offer a deal to the tenant to defer or waive rent for a couple of months, that's just more salt in the wound. So I think it's a good posture for tenants to offer to pay for the attorney fees for the lease amendments or whatever the agreement may be that's needed.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like anything you can do to make it easy for the
Mm-hmm.
landlord to make the answer yes, right? Is what you should offer. So before you talked about like don't breach your lease, right? Obviously communicate. But what would you say to the tenants, like they're just like barely holding on, and maybe this is their last shot. They don't know if they're gonna make it, but if they don't, they really want to put their heart into trying to save this business. But what kind of conversation would you have with them about staying into the lease?
Well, absolutely communicate with your landlord, as we
Mhm.
discussed.
Oh.
Another option always is subleasing.
Hmm.
You can sublease your entire premises or a section of your premises. Of course, you have to give notice and it has to be approved by the landlord.
Mhm.
But that's an option. It's not the best option if the tenant's trying to hang on and keep his business open. It's always nice to have those premises and not have to move during this time. Um, Bankruptcy, that's absolutely an option for tenants. And the good thing about bankruptcy, it would either prevent your landlord from filing an unlawful detainer, which is at the start of the eviction process, or it would, if the eviction process is already commenced, it would stay the eviction process and give the tenant a chance to reorganize and then be able, hopefully, to come out of bankruptcy and get back on his feet. But the protections of bankruptcy are absolutely an option for land or for tenants in this case, and if there was a personal guarantee, as there often is, uh, with regards to the lease, the bankruptcy protections will protect you personally, which is important. And it often is not, it's different from a residential foreclosure, as it won't harm your credit in the same.
Okay, okay. Can you talk a little bit about these personal guarantees? In my experience as well, like nearly 99% of these commercial leases have these personal guarantees. It's nearly impossible to get out of. But can you just shed a little bit of light about, you know, if they have them, how does that impact the negotiations and some of the resolutions coming out of this?
Right. Well, personal guarantee, especially for newer business, startup business, smaller businesses, are often required for the signing of the lease. And it essentially is putting you personally on the line for to perform the lease and not default or breach your covenants. Should anything arise that there is a breach, then the landlord can not only go after your business, but can also go after you personally, which obviously nobody wants to have happen. And that's why bankruptcy sometimes is a good option, just to protect yourself. How landlords know having a personal guarantee, it's just psychologically scary
Yeah.
tenants, and it gives the landlord some leverage to go after your personal assets. So your business is closed. Let's say my restaurant client, his business is closed and he has no profits coming in. Well, the landlord could always go after him personally for his house, his cars, his vacation home in Lake Arrowhead.
Yep.
And that's, you know, it does give the landlord some leverage.
Okay. All right. So we're kind of near the end here. Let me ask a couple more questions. You've been around the real estate area long enough. If someone's looking to hire someone to help them either negotiate a new lease or kind of get them through this, what are some things they should look for in a real estate attorney that would really benefit them?
Number one, whenever anybody is looking to hire an attorney, sit down with that attorney or Zoom. Now we're all doing our virtual meetings, and make sure you have a good rapport. The worst thing in the world is to hire an attorney and then find that there's a lack of communication, that you're not very comfortable with them. Maybe it was a name that's been recommended to you and your dad's best friend used him and he was outstanding, but the two of you are just not on the same page. That's a big red flag. The other thing I would always look for is to make sure that they return your calls or emails in a timely manner, especially in the beginning. If they're not doing it from the get-go, you're probably going to have trouble down the line. And you don't want to have an unlawful detainer proceeding, and you're trying to get a hold of your attorney who's supposed to be defending you, and you just keep getting an assistant or a voicemail and no return calls, no returned emails. So those are the two big things. And those are the biggest complaints I have heard from friends and family along the line if the attorney doesn't recall and so call them back. So those are two things to definitely look for. But also do your research, look at their website, make sure that they are barred. Although no thumbprint in the system, but you know, if there's reviews, read the reviews, see what the complaints were. I have mixed feelings on reviews. Sometimes it seems like people only write a review if it's something horrible. But on the other hand, if there's the same complaint, you know, definitely look and see if that's something you're willing to deal with or not. I would say feeling comfortable with the person and having a good rapport are the two most important things with hiring your attorney.
All right, fantastic. All right, so we're near the end here. I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions, and just answer the first thing that pops in your mouth. So, who do you look up to?
Ooh, Queen Elizabeth.
Okay, all right. What's the best business advice you've ever received?
Play to your strengths. Everybody has a weakness. Nobody's perfect, but play to your strengths.
All right. What's the best business book you've ever read?
I just read it and it was fantastic. Glennon Doyle's Untamed.
All right. And what's the biggest challenge in your business right now?
Biggest challenge in my business right now is being a small business owner in the times of
All
COVID.
right. And then this is the very last question here. Um, you lose everything. The only thing you have is your computer, the internet, and your phone. How do you rebuild your business in 30 days?
Oh my gosh, virtually.
All right, Laura, thank you so much for your time here. It's been very, very valuable. If we want to reach out to you, where can we find you?
Please do. I'm going to have more on this topic on my website. If your audience would like to continue and dive a little deeper, my website's Blue Law Group. So BLU lawgroup.com.
All right, so I'll put the link on the show notes here. Thank you again, Laura, for your time. It's super informative, and I think it's gonna help a lot of people.
Thank you for having me, Dan. It's been
My
fun.
pleasure. Thank you very much.